The darkness exploded without warning. One moment the jungle breathed its familiar humid rhythm, cicadas chirping in mechanical waves, and the next moment fire erupted from 3 directions at once, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning trapped in a bottle, and Private Takeshi Yamamoto felt his throat close around a scream that never escaped. The Americans were already inside the perimeter, not approaching, not probing, inside, moving, killing. The sound hit him like a physical force. Automatic weapons fire so close it felt like the bullets were cracking the air beside his eardrums, grenades detonating with sharp metallic barks that sent shrapnel singing through bamboo, and beneath it all, incomprehensibly, voices shouting in English, harsh and guttural and impossibly near. Yamamoto's hands fumbled for his rifle in the blackness, fingers numb with terror, and somewhere to his left he heard Corporal Tanaka make a wet, choking sound that ended too quickly, and then the footsteps came, boots pounding through the undergrowth with a speed that defied reason, and Yamamoto realized with crystalline horror that he had no idea how many attackers there were, or where they were coming from, or how they had gotten so close without a single sentry raising alarm. The Marines had been a distant threat before that night. Yamamoto and his unit had heard stories, of course. Every soldier in the Pacific Theater heard stories. But stories were wind, vapor, the exaggerations of frightened men who had broken under pressure. His company had fought the Americans twice before, brief skirmishes near the coast where both sides traded fire across open ground in daylight, where you could see your enemy and understand the geometry of combat, where warfare followed recognizable patterns that military training had prepared you to handle. Those encounters had been violent but comprehensible, battles that obeyed rules both sides understood. The Americans advanced, you fired, they took cover, you maneuvered, someone died, someone retreated, and eventually one side claimed the ground. It was war, brutal and deadly, but it made sense in the way that chess makes sense even when you lose. That understanding died the moment the darkness came alive with American fury. What terrified Yamamoto most was not the violence itself, but the speed at which it unfolded. He had expected Americans to fight like the training manuals described, methodical, cautious, dependent on their superior firepower and air support, advancing slowly behind artillery barrages and overwhelming material advantage. The doctrine drilled into every Japanese soldier emphasized this. Americans were soft, industrial fighters who avoided risk, who wouldn't press an attack without superiority in every category, who would never voluntarily fight at night when their technological advantages disappeared into the jungle dark. Yamamoto's commanders had assured them that nights belonged to the emperor's soldiers, that Japanese troops trained for nocturnal combat since childhood, that their spiritual discipline and night-adapted eyes gave them an insurmountable edge after sunset. The perimeter defences reflected this confidence, sentries posted at regulation intervals, machine gun positions oriented toward likely approach routes. But gaps existed because everyone knew, everyone had been told repeatedly, that no American force would dare attempt a night assault through dense jungle against prepared positions manned by soldiers who owned the darkness. That certainty shattered in seconds. The Marines didn't approach cautiously, or probe for weaknesses, or telegraph their assault with preparatory bombardment. They came like wolves into a sheep pen, fast and savage, and already among the flock before the first bleat of alarm could sound. Yamamoto heard Lieutenant Ito shouting orders somewhere behind him, the officer's voice climbing toward panic, and then the voice cut off mid-word, and Yamamoto knew with sick certainty that his lieutenant was dead, killed so quickly he didn't have time to finish his sentence. The speed of it felt impossible, supernatural. How could men move that fast through jungle at night? How could they navigate terrain that Japanese soldiers, who had occupied this position for 3 weeks, still found treacherous even in daylight? How could they coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously in pitch blackness without friendly fire incidents? The questions piled up in Yamamoto's mind, even as his body finally responded to his desperate mental commands, bringing his rifle up toward a shape moving through the darkness, a shadow darker than the surrounding shadows. but before he could squeeze the trigger, something massive slammed into his shoulder, and he went sprawling backward into the mud, his rifle flying from nerveless fingers, and he heard bootsteps pound past where his head had been a heartbeat before. The physical sensation of the attack was as disorienting as its speed. Yamamoto had expected bullets if the Americans came, rifle fire, machine gun fire, the familiar physics of projectiles travelling through air. But the Marines brought something more primal. Grenades detonated with percussion that felt like fists hammering his chest cavity, compression waves that rattled his teeth and made his vision swim. Rifle stocks swung in the darkness, connected with bone-crushing force, delivered with practiced efficiency by men who seemed to see perfectly despite the absolute absence of light. Knives appeared from nowhere, wet sounds following close behind, intimate sounds that carried in ways gunfire didn't, personal sounds that spoke of close-range butchery. The Americans fought with a physical aggression that shocked Yamamoto more than any technical superiority could have. They didn't maintain tactical distance or rely on firepower supremacy. They closed to contact and grappled and smashed and stabbed with a feral intensity that contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had said about soft Western soldiers who feared death and hardship. Time became meaningless in the chaos. Yamamoto couldn't tell if the attack had lasted 30 seconds or 30 minutes. The darkness stretched and compressed, elastic and unreliable, marked only by strobe light moments of muzzle flash that revealed nightmare tableaus. Private Saito, with his hands to his throat, blood black in the brief illumination, eyes wide with incomprehension. Sergeant Nakamura swinging his rifle like a club at an American who ducked underneath the blow and drove a knee into Nakamura's midsection with such force that the sergeant folded in half. The machine gun position that had anchored the defensive line now silent. 3 bodies sprawled around it in postures that suggested they had died before realizing they were under attack. Each flash of light revealed disaster, and then darkness swallowed the scene again, leaving only after-images burned into Yamamoto's retinas, ghosts layered over ghosts as he scrambled backward through undergrowth that tore at his uniform and face. The sound of the Americans moving was what finally broke something in Yamamoto's mind. Not individual footsteps, but a collective rush. Multiple men moving in coordination, boots hitting earth in near unison, creating a drumbeat that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They didn't creep or sneak or advance cautiously despite the darkness and unfamiliar terrain. They ran. They charged. They moved with absolute confidence through an environment that should have reduced every soldier to slow, careful steps with outstretched hands, feeling for obstacles. The speed implied intimate knowledge of the ground, suggested reconnaissance and planning and preparation that made a mockery of Japanese perimeter security. How long had the Americans been watching? How many nights had they crept close to observe patrol patterns and defensive positions? The questions induced a paranoia that Yamamoto could feel spreading through his nervous system like ice water in his veins. If they had been watching for days or weeks, unseen and unsuspected, what else did they know? What other positions were compromised? Who else was in their sights? The psychological dimension of the attack was more devastating than the physical casualties. Yamamoto had been trained to endure hardship, to face death with dignity, to maintain discipline under fire. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this particular species of terror. Fear in conventional combat was manageable, even useful, sharpening reflexes and heightening awareness. You saw the enemy, assessed the threat, chose your response. Fear had a target, a focus. But this was different. This was fighting shadows, reacting to sounds that seemed to come from inside his own head, spinning in darkness, while invisible attackers materialized and vanished like jungle spirits. The Americans had weaponized darkness itself, turned the night into a collaborator, made the familiar terrain feel alien and hostile. Yamamoto felt his mind fragmenting, his thoughts scattering like startled birds, coherent tactical thinking dissolving into pure animal panic. He wanted to run, wanted to flee into the jungle and keep running until he reached the coast, or fell from exhaustion, anything to escape this nightmare where death moved faster than thought and struck from angles that shouldn't exist. What made it worse was the contrast between expectation and reality. Japanese doctrine emphasized night fighting because it negated American advantages in artillery, air support, and armored vehicles. Darkness was supposed to be the great equalizer, the battlefield where superior spirit and training overcame material disadvantage. Yamamoto's unit had conducted night exercises, practiced moving through darkness, developed hand signals and verbal codes for coordinating without light. They were good at it, or so they had believed. They had internalized a sense of nocturnal superiority that went beyond tactical assessment and became an article of faith. And then the Marines came, and in 30 seconds of brutal violence, they demonstrated that everything Japanese soldiers believed about night combat was fantasy, wishful thinking, propaganda that collapsed under the weight of reality. The psychological impact of that revelation was perhaps more damaging than the physical casualties, because it poisoned the well of confidence that every soldier drinks from, introduced doubt into areas that had seemed certain, suggested that other cherished beliefs might be equally false. Yamamoto crawled through mud and vegetation, his breath coming in ragged gasps that seemed impossibly loud, certain that every American within 100 meters could hear him, could triangulate his position from the sound of air rasping through his throat. Behind him, the sounds of combat were already diminishing, which seemed impossible because it felt like he had been crawling for hours, but rational thought suggested only a few minutes had passed, maybe less. The attack was ending, not concluding in a gradual wind-down of firing as both sides disengaged, but simply stopping, as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise of battle had been, because it meant the Americans had accomplished their objective and withdrawn, vanishing back into the jungle as quickly as they had emerged, leaving behind only corpses and wounded and shocked survivors like Yamamoto, who couldn't understand what had just happened. He lay in the mud for an eternity, listening, trying to distinguish between normal jungle sounds and the subtle signs of human presence, but his ears rang from explosions, and every rustle of vegetation sounded like approaching footsteps. Slowly, with infinite caution, he raised his head and tried to assess the situation. The defensive position that had seemed so solid in daylight now looked pathetic, inadequate. Child's play defenses against adult predators. Bodies lay scattered in the darkness, unmoving lumps that Yamamoto tried not to look at directly, because looking at them meant acknowledging who they had been, friends and comrades transformed into meat by American violence. The machine gun position was destroyed, the crew dead, the gun itself missing. The Americans had taken it, Yamamoto realized with fresh horror. They had time, during their attack, to disable and steal the heavy weapon, which meant they weren't just killing randomly, but executing a precise plan despite the speed and chaos. How was that possible? How could men move that fast and still think clearly enough to complete secondary objectives? Other survivors began to emerge from hiding places, moving like ghosts themselves, faces pale in the pre-dawn darkness that was just beginning to dilute the pure black of night. Yamamoto counted 9 men still alive and functional out of a platoon that had numbered 32 when the sun set. 23 casualties inflicted in perhaps 5 minutes of combat, maybe less. The mathematics of it were staggering, suggested a level of combat efficiency that seemed more machine than human. The survivors gathered in a tight cluster, backs to each other, rifles pointing outward at shadows that might contain anything, nerves stretched to breaking point. Nobody spoke. Speaking would mean admitting what had happened, giving voice to the fear that now lived in all of them, acknowledging that everything they thought they knew about themselves and their enemies had been wrong. When Lieutenant Sato arrived an hour later with reinforcements from another company, Yamamoto watched the officer's face transform as he surveyed the scene. Sato was a veteran, had fought in China, had killed men, and seen men killed, but something about this carnage affected him differently. Perhaps it was the speed implied by the casualty distribution, bodies clustered in groups suggesting they had died before they could disperse to fighting positions, or the precision of the targeting. Every leadership position hit, every crew-served weapon neutralized or stolen, the attack clearly planned with specific objectives rather than random violence. Saito walked the perimeter slowly, stopping at each body, examining wounds with a surgeon's detachment that couldn't quite mask the fear in his eyes. When he finished his circuit, he stood silent for a long moment, staring into the jungle, as if he could see the Americans still out there, watching, waiting, planning their next strike. The interrogation that followed was perfunctory, mechanical, Saito going through the motions of debriefing, even though the facts were obvious. The Americans had infiltrated undetected, attacked simultaneously from multiple directions, inflicted massive casualties, and withdrawn cleanly without leaving wounded or dead behind. Yamamoto tried to explain the speed of it, the impossibility of what he had witnessed, but words failed him. How do you convey the sensation of time compressing, of events unfolding faster than consciousness could process? Saito's questions became increasingly pointed. Why hadn't sentries spotted the approach? Why hadn't the machine gun position provided suppressing fire? Why had discipline broken down so completely? Yamamoto heard the subtext beneath the words. Saito was looking for explanations that preserved doctrine, that allowed the disaster to be categorized as a failure of execution rather than a failure of understanding. But there was no such explanation. The sentries had been at their posts and died there without raising alarm. The machine gun crew had been alert and prepared and died anyway. Discipline hadn't broken down. It had been shattered by overwhelming violence delivered faster than training could respond to. As dawn broke and details became visible, the full scope of the disaster emerged. The Americans had carved through the defensive position like water through paper, following routes that suggested detailed reconnaissance and terrain knowledge. They had avoided the few prepared obstacles and approached through gaps in the perimeter that Japanese planners had dismissed as too difficult to navigate in darkness. They had carried away not just the machine gun, but also a radio, maps, and several rifles, equipment too bulky and heavy to be looted by soldiers in frantic retreat, suggesting instead a methodical collection of specific items during or immediately after the assault. This was not opportunistic violence, but calculated warfare prosecuted with terrifying efficiency. The psychological aftermath spread through the regiment like disease. Within days, every unit in the sector knew about the attack, details amplified and distorted through retelling, until the Marines became supernatural entities, demons who could see in perfect darkness and move like shadows. Officers tried to control the rumors, issued stern warnings against defeatist talk, but the stories persisted because they contained an essential truth that every soldier recognized. The Americans had demonstrated mastery of night combat that exceeded Japanese capabilities by a margin too wide to be explained by training alone. Something else was at work, some combination of aggression and skill and tactical philosophy that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated. Yamamoto volunteered for a patrol 3 days after the attack, partly to prove to himself that he could still function, partly because staying in camp felt more dangerous than moving through the jungle. His squad moved with exaggerated caution, every man hyper-alert to sounds and shadows, everyone imagining Americans behind every tree. The patrol accomplished nothing useful, found no enemy, returned to base having achieved only the confirmation that fear could become a tactical handicap, that enough dread could paralyze soldiers more effectively than enemy fire. Night became a burden that settled over every Japanese position at sunset, tension rising as darkness fell, men staring into the jungle with the certain knowledge that somewhere out there Marines were preparing to move. The speed of the American attacks became legendary, passed from unit to unit, company to company, until every Japanese soldier in the sector had absorbed the lesson. When Marines decided to strike at night, they hit harder and faster than daytime combat could prepare you for. The contradiction was maddening. Americans were supposed to be cautious, methodical fighters who relied on material superiority. Night combat should have negated those advantages and favoured Japanese troops with their emphasis on spirit and close combat. But the Marines turned expectations inside out, proved more aggressive in darkness than Japanese soldiers had ever imagined possible. They weaponized speed itself, used velocity as a force multiplier, moved so fast that defenders couldn't coordinate responses before the attack was already over. Tactical adjustments followed, Japanese commanders revising defensive doctrine to account for the American night capabilities. Perimeters were tightened, sentries doubled, machine gun positions reinforced, but these changes carried their own psychological cost. Every adjustment was an admission that previous dispositions had been inadequate, that Japanese tactical thinking had failed to anticipate enemy capabilities. The confidence that had characterized Japanese forces in the early stages of the Pacific Campaign was eroding, not from defeats in conventional battle, but from these lightning night strikes that demonstrated American advantages in areas where Japanese superiority had seemed guaranteed. You could win firefights during the day and still lose the psychological war at night, and that realization spread a particular species of despair through the ranks. Yamamoto found himself unable to sleep properly, startling awake at every jungle sound, certain that the moment he closed his eyes would be the moment Americans materialized from the darkness. He wasn't alone. Throughout the company, men developed similar symptoms: hypervigilance, insomnia, startle responses to mundane sounds. Combat fatigue was setting in without conventional combat, exhaustion accumulating from constant tension rather than physical exertion. The Americans were weaponizing anticipation, making the threat of attack as effective as actual attacks, forcing Japanese units to maintain peak alertness every night, despite the physical impossibility of sustaining that state long term. It was psychological warfare of the most effective kind, achieved not through propaganda, but through demonstrations of combat capability so far beyond expectations that imagination filled in the gaps with something worse than reality. The pattern repeated across the sector. Every few nights another position would be hit. Another unit would experience the nightmare of invisible Americans erupting from darkness, moving faster than defense could respond to, killing with brutal efficiency and vanishing before reinforcements arrived. The attacks were too frequent to be random, but too unpredictable to anticipate, forcing every Japanese position to maintain maximum readiness every night, draining units of energy and morale in equal measure. Command tried to respond with aggressive patrolling, pushing forces into the jungle to intercept American raiders before they reached Japanese lines. But the patrols found nothing, or worse, were themselves ambushed by enemy forces that seemed to know exactly where Japanese patrols would be and when they would arrive. The speed advantage worked in both directions. Marines could ambush patrols with the same terrifying velocity they brought to defensive positions, could trigger ambushes and disengage before Japanese forces could mount effective counterattacks. Weeks became months, and the psychological damage accumulated. Yamamoto watched his comrades deteriorate, saw the confidence drain from veteran soldiers, heard the desperate edge in officers' voices when they issued orders that everyone knew were inadequate. The Americans had discovered something fundamental about warfare in the Pacific, had developed a tactical approach that leveraged their strengths while exploiting Japanese weaknesses in ways that doctrine hadn't predicted. Speed was the key. Not just physical speed, but cognitive speed. The ability to observe and orient and decide and act faster than opponents could complete the same cycle, to move inside the enemy's decision loop and stay there, operating at a tempo that made effective response impossible. The night raids became defining experiences, moments that shaped how every Japanese soldier in the theater understood the war they were fighting. You could maintain the propaganda narrative during daylight hours, could convince yourself that Japanese spirit and training provided insurmountable advantages, but darkness brought truth in the form of American Marines who moved like predators and struck like lightning. The psychological impact rippled outward, affecting units that hadn't yet experienced night raids directly, because the stories spread faster than official communications and carried more weight because they came from fellow soldiers rather than officers or propagandists. Every Japanese position in the Pacific became haunted by the possibility of American night attack, and that haunting was perhaps the most effective weapon the Marines deployed. Yamamoto survived 2 more night raids before he was transferred to a different sector, and each attack confirmed and reinforced the lessons of the first. Americans came fast and hard, hit multiple objectives simultaneously, killed with practiced efficiency, and vanished before effective counterattack could develop. The speed of it never became familiar, never stopped shocking his system, never allowed him to develop the kind of tactical response that might have restored some sense of control. Each attack was a fresh demonstration that his training and doctrine were inadequate, that the war he had prepared to fight bore little resemblance to the war Americans were actually prosecuting. Years later, long after the war ended, Yamamoto would struggle to explain to civilians what combat had been like, would find himself unable to convey the specific terror of those night raids. The speed was at the core of it, the sense of time compressing and events unfolding faster than human reaction could follow. But more than that was the psychological dislocation of having your expectations so thoroughly demolished. Japanese soldiers had been taught that they were superior night fighters, that Americans feared close combat and darkness, that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage. The Marines shattered every assumption in minutes of savage violence, and the psychological aftershocks of that shattering lasted longer than any physical wound could have. Fear of that speed, that overwhelming velocity of American aggression unleashed in darkness, became a permanent resident in his nervous system, a muscle memory of terror that would trigger at unexpected moments for the rest of his life. Shadows moving too quickly at dusk, footsteps approaching from behind, the sudden sound of breaking branches in twilight. The night raids didn't win the war by themselves, but they won something perhaps more important. They broke the psychological dominance that Japanese forces had established in the early Pacific campaign, introduced doubt into areas that had seemed certain, demonstrated that American soldiers could match and exceed Japanese troops in the kind of close-quarters night combat that was supposed to be Japan's specialty. Speed became the signature of American night tactics, a tempo of operations that Japanese forces couldn't match and couldn't counter, and that speed did more damage to morale than casualties ever could. Because casualties could be absorbed, could be contextualized as unfortunate but inevitable costs of war. But the systematic destruction of doctrine and belief was harder to recover from, introduced a kind of despair that no amount of training or indoctrination could overcome. The last thought Yamamoto had, huddled in darkness on his final night in that sector, listening to jungle sounds that might conceal approaching Americans, was that warfare had changed and nobody had bothered to tell the Japanese army. The Americans had brought something new to the Pacific theater, not technology or firepower, but a philosophy of aggression that weaponized speed and psychological shock in ways that traditional military thinking hadn't anticipated. They had made darkness into an ally, turned the night from equalizer into amplifier of their advantages, and they had done it by simply refusing to fight the way Japanese doctrine said they would. That refusal, that willingness to charge into darkness with the same confidence they brought to daylight operations, had broken something fundamental in Japanese defensive planning. And as dawn broke over the jungle and another night passed without attack, which somehow felt worse than an attack, because it meant the tension would simply roll forward into the next night and the next, never resolving, never allowing release, Yamamoto finally understood what real fear felt like. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the deep fear of inadequacy, the knowledge that your enemy was better than you at something you had believed was your specialty, that all your training and preparation had been based on false assumptions, and that every night going forward would bring the possibility of Americans moving through darkness at speeds that made mockery of defensive doctrine. That fear would live in him forever, a permanent shadow cast by the memory of footsteps pounding through jungle faster than human feet should move, shapes appearing from nothing and vanishing before his rifle could track them, and the terrible, final knowledge that speed itself had become a weapon, and the Americans wielded it with casual mastery.